for progressive music, they were probably the most hard, tough band playing progressive music, because often progressive music can be quite fiddly and noodly and not have the guts that, and I think that's what they brought to the table, Neil, with the sheer force of his playing. He wasn't a great feel player. That was always a sort of a battle for him to sort of, he was very meticulous. Everything was worked out. He was the only one in the band who, if they ever did a video, which he always reluctantly agreed to because he didn't like doing videos, he was the only one that when they were, because in the video they'd invariably play along with the pre-recorded song, he was the only one that would be actually note perfect. Like, you could put the camera on him and he'd play along with the track, and every single hit would be dead on. And it's like his choice of drums, his choice of cymbals, and in his case that is even more extraordinary, because that was one of the things he brought to drumming, was this kind of sort of architectural approach to the drum arrangements. It wasn't just about playing a groove and then throwing in a fill and playing a groove. It was like, sometimes they were like, a Limelight is a great case in point. It's like there's almost no two bars that are the same beat. It actually sounds relatively straightforward as a song. It's a powerful riff-driven song, but his drum part is extraordinarily complex, and he never settles into playing straight groove, I don't think, at virtually any point in the song. It's always kind of like, you know, he plays maybe sort of one or two bars that are the same, but it's constantly changing. And you know, it's things like that defined who Rush were, I think. And the three-piece thing is a big deal. Alex would always have been experimenting with different guitars. He had his core guitar at the time. For the most part, he was using a Gibson 355, which is a hollow body, but it's actually solid body in the center. It looks like a big hollow body. Looks like a 335 or 345. But it's dead solid in the middle, like a Les Paul. So with sort of hollow pockets on the other side. So it's slightly more resonant and a more interesting thing. But Alex always had a big dynamic shift between just the power stuff and the picking stuff. And also he covered a lot of ground in the way he played. That's one of the appeals of his playing, was that he'd go from chordal stuff to lead stuff, back to chordal stuff. And as part of the three-piece ethic, you've got a lot of ground to cover. So you know, if you're playing lead, suddenly there's no rhythm guitar. Unlike, you know, other guitar bands where you've usually got a bed track of rhythm playing and stuff, and then the guitar solo is just stuck on top of it. When you've got a three-piece, as soon as somebody goes off and plays lead, then some of the core fundamental kind of rhythm section is gone. So somebody else has to take that role. And in that case, you know, that's where that's one of the great things about a three-piece, is that everybody gets to do a lot of stuff because you've got a lot of ground to cover. And so if somebody's playing lead, then the bass and the drums really have to fill out the rhythm section and the bottom end in a powerful way, in a different way. So I think that his whole guitar style is based around that. A lot of changes, you know, in sort of the way he approaches it, from the clean stuff he plays. So I think, and you know, he would have gone through a bunch of different guitars and experimented with things like that. So I think that the changes sonically are probably more driven by the arrangement structure than they are by kind of finding a guitar tone, you know, intentionally to be this way or that way. I think there's just sort of a natural progression. Bass player singers are an interesting dynamic, because from a writing point of view, you're able to kind of hold down the root of a chord and define the rhythm as well, and then sing any melody you like, because or not any melody you like, but you're not constrained by the kind of key relationship of the majors and minor keys that you get as soon as you play thirds in a chord. You've already sort of defined partly what you could do melodically, whereas when you just play a root note, you can sing, which is, I think, one of the reasons why somebody like Sting came out with a very unusual melodic approach. That was one of his defining qualities, was that his melodies were different to what people had heard before. And, you know, he's a bass player, you know, just holding down the bottom end and then singing a melody. Whereas as soon as you play some chords, you've already defined, okay, you can only go here, there, or. On the purely three-piece level, you're all three musicians are ready to go full out all the time, or kind of simplify. They have a lot of dynamics. Like Alex is, from a guitar playing point of view, he's going from playing power chords to a solo part, and then back down and back into chords, back up into solo, back into. There's a lot of range there that creates inherently a lot of dynamic. And similarly with Geddy, because he's like the aggressive bass playing, he's the only bass player I know of that broke strings regularly. He would quite often break an E string on his bass, which you never hear about people doing that. I only witnessed him do it once, but it was like, you broke a string? He says, yeah, I break strings all the time. It's like, because of his really aggressive approach to playing. From a point of view of dimension, they also had one other key thing that they would do, which was Geddy would use bass pedals, which were the Taurus pedals, which would give you a sub-octave that was lower, or it would sometimes take up the real low end, which would allow him to play, you know, high up on the bass while still having something that was deep and underneath. And also, they would also have like a high string synth, which would be like this gloss on everything. And they would just sometimes triggered from the same foot pedal, the same pedal that he'd play for the Taurus pedal, bass pedal, would also bring in a sort of high zing of orchestrated kind of, just a single note, you know, like somebody'd have like his big Oberheim synthesizer all set. That big one that he had on stage was basically just set to make one note. So when you press the Taurus pedals, you get a huge deep sound and a high kind of sound, like to orchestrate it. So that kind of gave them a little bit of, you know, sort of room, so that then they could take up the middle ground, being more, Geddy could play higher, play more aggressive, you know. And often some of their power stuff is where the bass and the guitar were riffing together, doing almost the same thing, and Geddy basically an octave down from what Alex was doing. And I used that to some effect when I did the Different Stages live album, which was the first one where they'd recorded almost every show that they were doing, because traditionally live albums were recorded with a truck that was very expensive, and you'd maybe get to record, you know, half a dozen gigs. Because it was very expensive, like $5,000 a day to have a truck on the road with a guy, and you know. When we did Different Stages, one of the things that was a problem with the three piece is that if you take the guitar sound and put it on one side, so you've got a nice stereo image, it's kind of lopsided. So you have to put the guitar sound in the middle. But the bass inherently kind of lives in the middle anyway, because low end and thick and fat, if you put that on one side. So it's kind of tricky. So on that album, I took a cue from, I think, Van Halen 1, which was, I believe, guitar on one side, bass on the other side, and or at least for some of it. And thought, hang on, that's an interesting approach. It could work really well without having to sort of blur out the guitar with a delay to make it sound wide and washed out. We could keep it like focused guitar sound and focused bass sound, added to which it was kind of fun because it meant that, you know, you got three individuals there. And it really worked well when they were basically just playing sort of unison type riffs. You could push them really wide and have guitar on the left, bass on the right, drums come in the middle. It would sound massive and huge. But then obviously sometimes when it got more, the bass was maybe just more simplified, holding down the root, and their guitar, they're very different, then it would be a bit lopsided, so I'd pull them back in a bit. But the whole approach to a three-piece gives you this kind of different space, and it's all driven. As soon as one person stops playing, you've only got two left. so they better be doing something interesting, which is, that's the whole dynamic. I mean, I think that funnily enough, one of the most interesting three pieces that's maybe one of the reasons they were influential in those days was when the Police came on the scene, because there you have a very different style of three-piece, clean guitars, deep sort of reggae influenced bass, quite complex drumming, but they were very enamored with what the Police were doing in the early days, and that had a effect on them. In terms of the recording live, they went through a bunch of eras. The first recording was All the World's a Stage, which they hated. It's probably well known that the band hated it because it was so raw and messy from their point of view. Fans loved it. Then when they came to do Exit Stage Left, they were so desperate to not have any mistakes. They didn't want any dirty laundry hanging out there. They wanted it to be everything meticulous. So almost everything was re-recorded on it. Like the drums are still there, but I think probably a large part of the guitars, bass, and there was so much of it that was redone that it wasn't so much of a live album anymore, except the spirit of the live performance being the core of the tracks. The next live album I did was Show of Hands, and that one was that was a little bit more balanced, but that was also in the era where there was a lot of keyboard stuff, because they'd done all of the Power Windows records and stuff like that, so they were more orchestrated. And then the last one that I did was one where they recorded every show. They recorded them unfortunately on ADAT machines, which not the greatest way to record, but the whole idea was, with a rack of ADAT machines, we can record every show, and if we play great, we've got it. Whereas when you record and you take a truck on the road, you either commit yourself to spending like $1 million on recording all the shows, or you record select ones, and then that puts an inordinate amount of pressure on you playing. We're recording tonight, so we have to play great, and also you never know where you're going to be. It's going to sound best, and so so when the last one I did with them, just one show in Chicago just sounded so much better than all the others that we used it for like 75% of the album, and so there's all these different dynamics come into play. I think looking back now, it's I mean, now when you can go to a live concert and the PA sounds extraordinary, the lighting is extraordinary, all of the various elements are extraordinary, and invariably these days people have like click tracks that they're playing to with a lot of extra augmented reality brought into the arrangements and stuff. So live shows actually do tend to sound like the album. Sometimes they even sound better. That never existed back 20, 30 years ago. It just did not exist. It was a struggle to try and get live what was being done on the album. So I think that most bands, particularly kind of a band like Rush or a technical band, the live show was a struggle to try and do that, even though their exuberance in their playing, that would have been a huge motivator to just drive them. But I don't, I think that the fact they loved playing up on stage, they were having a great time, and the fans seemed to be loving it. And it was only when they played it back, the recording back, and they sit and listen to it and go, ooh, that's not, I think they would be, from their perspective, it was like, okay, this isn't what we would, if it's going to be available for people to play over and over again on an album, we need to fix that, because that's driving me. I can't bear that somebody can listen to that either out of tune, out of time, or this or that. But I think once for them now, probably they don't feel, they'd still, as perfectionists, they'll still have an element of that, but they probably can appreciate spontaneous stuff that wasn't what they intended, but actually has they can look past it and enjoy it more now than they could then. I think that, but that's why when I come back to sort of people's insecurities, it's like sometimes that it's the insecurities of some artists that drive them to be great at what they do, because they can't accept, things. And so the fact that a fan might like that doesn't lessen the fact that the artists themselves can't bear it. So I think that there's a very strong difference in perspective there. So I think that one of the things about that band is that they really do go to a lot of trouble to have fun on stage. Like the dynamic between them is really good. Neil beats himself up quite a lot. I think he puts a lot of pressure on himself to be as perfect as he possibly can. And once he's done it, he doesn't really want to do another show, because once he's achieved perfection, it's like, okay, I did it now. I don't need to do it again and again. And it's so he has to sort of trick himself into motivating himself. He's very sort of goal-driven kind of guy. That once he's got, there's a mountain, I've got to climb it. Once I got there, I don't want to climb it again, kind of approach. And so he has to constantly kind of self-motivate himself to keep going out there and doing it again and again. Whereas I think Geddy and Alex are more that just, you can, when you watch them on stage, they're having a bit more of a party, just and the humor as well. The three of them together are really quite extraordinary. I think that's also, yet again, one of the things about a three-piece is that you don't need to, people in a three-piece, you don't need to be jealous about the other guy. I mean, it might not have worked for the Police, but for the most part, it's not like a bunch of guys and one important guy. That everybody is really important, and you can hear what everybody does, because it's not buried amongst a large arrangement with a big wodge of keyboards over covering up the guitar or something. Whereas for a band like Yes, the interpersonal dynamics become kind of more fractured.